Tomorrow, January 6th, is Epiphany, which marks the end of the Christmas season. If you're singing the song, Epiphany is the 12th day of Christmas. So, if the wise men brought drums, there were 12 of them, not 3. Just sit with that for a while. For the early years of Christianity, Epiphany wasn't the end of the Christmas season because Christmas wasn't celebrated until the 4th century. And Christmas didn't really take off as a celebration until many centuries after that. In those early centuries of the church, Epiphany was the first of 3 large Christian festivals of the Christian year, the other 2 being Easter and Pentecost. Epiphany was more important than Christmas because Epiphany focused not on the fact of a baby being born, but on the signs that showed the world just who that baby was. The word Epiphany appears only occasionally in the Bible. One is in the book of 2nd Maccabees, which is a book included in Catholic Bibles, but not often in Protestant ones, where it describes the appearance of the presence of God in the 1st century before the birth of Jesus. There are just 6 mentions of the word Epiphany in the entire New Testament. 1 is in 2 Thessalonians, 4 are in 2 Timothy, and 1 is in Titus. In those places, the Greek word is translated as brightness, illumination, or appearing, depending on the translation. And all of those letters go to either Greek churches or Greek overseers of those churches. The festival of Epiphany, which began in the Greek church, celebrates the initial signs in the Bible which showed that Jesus was, in some way that the church wrestled with for centuries, divine. There are 2 and sometimes 3 of those early events that are celebrated at Epiphany. The first revelation is the coming of the wise men to Bethlehem. Foreign kings or astrologers or dignitaries, whatever they were really rich, who traveled for years to follow a star that they discerned marked the birth of the King of the Jews, became the first sign that this was a special child. I think the shepherds would like a word here after their visit from the angels, but Epiphany kind of looks the other way at them and focuses on the kings. The second sign of Jesus' identity comes 30 years later when Jesus is baptized by John the Baptist in the River Jordan at the outset of his ministry. Many were baptized, of course, but it was only at Jesus' baptism that Matthew 13 records a dove descending on Jesus and a voice saying, "This is my beloved Son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased." Identity revealed, second recorded sign. For those traditions that celebrate a third revelatory moment for Epiphany, John's gospel steps in to tell us of Jesus' first miracle, turning the water into wine at Cana of Galilee. They are all points of revelation, aha moments for gospel readers, the first signs that illumine Jesus' true nature, which is what that Epiphany word means. Those aha moments, those instances of revelation that indicate the presence of God among us in the person of Jesus, are what the festival of Epiphany highlights. However, the general word epiphany is not just a religious word in English. We say we've had an epiphany when the truth about a particular person or situation finally dawns on us. We see something and say, "Oh, now I get it." It could be a religious epiphany, but it doesn't have to be. Epiphanies also don't have to recognize glorious truths in the way we use the word. When used for people, I think it's nicely summed up in the Maya Angelou quote, "When someone shows you who they are, believe them." The truths revealed to us in a person's actions might uncover any number of things about a person's nature, not all of which are glorious. Sometimes they are, sometimes not so much. I've titled this sermon, Guided by Starlight, not just to reflect the wise men using a star in the heavens to guide them to the place where Jesus lay, but to indicate how I'm planning to navigate this whole year of 2025 in worship and in sermons. I'm hoping that we can look both out and up for our own lives' epiphanies, to find signs that reveal God's calling on our lives and God's presence in our midst. We'll be looking across the year at things that illumine, things that shine and point to the way where Jesus can be found, understood, and thereby emulated in this world today. In the service last week, Laura mentioned that the theme for this year in worship would be calling, and then led us through a reflection on 3 related questions. That was a really helpful exercise for me in shaping this year, and I quickly filled up 2 pages of notes. Those notes included the particulars of how I felt called by God in my own life, but also included notes about how others might find those questions confusing or totally outside their experience or limiting in some way or another. So starting next week, I'll try to help those of you who may have felt those things to reframe the questions about calling in a way that connects them to everybody's life and experiences. And maybe even today, some of my experiences might help. For example, last week, when I looked over my own list of times when I've strongly felt God's call on my life, I noticed that they were all things I felt God had called me to do, to enter into ministry, to go to the Bible Society, to leap back into the fire and say yes to Bishop Devidar to go to Crawford Memorial United Methodist Church. And I thought about that it was a list of doing. In many ways, God calling us to do a particular thing is the most difficult kind of calling from God to discern, because it's different for every single person. And typically, it's different for the same person across a lifetime as we cross into different ages and stages and circumstances in our lives. That discernment can be learned, and we'll talk about that this year, but it left out a bigger and arguably more important kind of calling. The calling not about what each of us should do, but about the kind of person God calls every one of us to be. There's overlap, of course. Maya Angelou's quote, "When someone shows you who they are, believe them," indicates that a person's inner nature shows up in their outward actions. She didn't say, "When someone tells you who they are, believe them." She said, "When someone shows you who they are, believe them." And I think she has that exactly right. That said, it's much, much easier to discern the kind of person God is calling us to be than it is to discern the specifics of what God is calling us as individuals to do. Who we are called to be is plastered all over the Bible, in both word and example, in both the Old and the New Testaments. And if we can get the who we are called to be part right, the what we are called to do becomes, if not simple, at least easier. So we're going to start there. with who we are called to be in the first part of the year, and then move to how that inner nature can help us figure out our own life's meaning, purpose, and calling, which will occupy roughly the second part of the year. Along the way, we'll look at characters in the Bible and passages of Scripture, but also at other individuals known for their virtue and faithfulness, from ancient to modern, across all walks of life, some named as saints in the church, others whose overall goodness has made them beacons of light, despite whatever human failings they no doubt possessed. By looking at their lives, we can find clues about how we might cultivate those virtues in ourselves, or even what those virtues are, and see how an inner nature shaped by those things can change our outlook on life, our relationships with others, and perhaps even change the world in which we live. To kick that off, I want to leave you this morning with a contemporary example of a man whose century of service will be lauded across all of this month. And I mean, of course, Jimmy Carter. Former President Jimmy Carter holds a special place in my heart, as he burst onto the scene just as I was coming into adulthood. In 1976, during his winning campaign for the presidency, I was still just 17 and couldn't vote for him. But I was so taken with him that I campaigned for him on my college campus and convinced many of my friends who could vote to get themselves out there and do it. I was still in the fundamentalist stage of my faith at that point, and after the scandals of Nixon, it was a wonder to me that a peanut farmer from a tiny, mostly black town in Georgia, who openly talked about being a born-again Christian, was running for the highest office in the land. Even more amazing to me was that in everything written about him, and there was a lot since he had already served as governor of Georgia, and I bought every single book that was by him or about him and read them cover to cover. No one could produce anything to suggest that the persona we saw on the campaign trail was anything other than he actually was. Down to earth, intellectually brilliant, devoted to God, devoted to his wife, humble, caring about every other person on the planet, as well as the planet himself. Jimmy Carter installed solar panels at the White House to power the water heating the staff kitchen, and highlighted and funded the need and push for renewable energy. Reagan had both the solar panels and that funding removed. The worst scandal of Carter's presidency was when, in an interview with Playboy magazine, which was scandalous enough, Carter confessed to lusting after another woman in his heart. Oh, for those days. He was married to Rosalind for 77 years. When asked later about his greatest accomplishment, he didn't name becoming president, the Camp David Accords, winning the Nobel Peace Prize. He named marrying Rosalind. They tried to manufacture dirt about Jimmy Carter by pointing to the failings of his younger brother, Billy, who had an alcohol addiction that led to outrageous behavior and landed him in rehab. Billy also had some questionable relationships with Libya, later registering as a foreign agent, a governor, whatever it is, registering as an agent for a foreign government. Reporting on that came to be known as Billygate, and it was later found to be a foreign influence campaign trying to interfere with the 1980 election. Jimmy Carter lost the 1980 election to Ronald Reagan, but his return to the life of a mere citizen became an even clearer lens for his true nature. On the faith front, Jimmy Carter was a Southern Baptist and taught an adult Sunday school class at his Baptist church in Plains, Georgia, for almost 70 years, including the years he was in the White House. Over time, he grew upset with the Southern Baptist Church, troubled by their continued unwillingness to accept women in leadership. He made a formal break with the denomination 25 years ago. His own church in Plains was part of the more moderate Cooperative Baptist Fellowship, which Carter himself helped establish. Whatever you thought of his actual presidency and policies, I don't believe there has ever been a better human being to sit in the Oval Office. I encourage you to listen to the various tributes that are already being published and that will be both published and spoken across this month. It already began as he arrived in Atlanta yesterday, but especially this Thursday, which has been established as a national day of mourning for him. But don't just read or listen to all of that to learn facts about his life. Look at those facts through the lens of what it means to be a Christian. If you applied Maya Angelou's test of when someone shows you who they are, believe them, who did Jimmy Carter show himself to be? Ask yourself that as you read and watch and listen. There are countless amazing stories from his life, but I'll highlight just a few that show me who he was. Of course, there's the Sunday school teacher part. But it wasn't just teaching Sunday school. It was the little things surrounding that. First, across my 30 years in ministry, lots of people have told me that they don't have time to teach Sunday school. Jimmy Carter taught Sunday school when he was president of the United States. And he still did it in his home church in Plains, Georgia. He could have easily moved that class to DC and nobody would have batted an eye. But then the people that he knew in Plains, Georgia, that he'd grown up with, wouldn't have been able to come. He did that 30 to 35 times every year. He still went to Plains. He still taught a 45-minute Sunday school lesson at the Maranatha Baptist Church where he grew up. Hundreds came from all across the country every time he was teaching. As Carter waited for his time to come to the podium, he sat in a folding chair in the corner. He would allow anyone who wanted to take pictures with him after the class, but he wouldn't sign autographs there. No applause for him was allowed. Before Jimmy Carter served his country as president, he served his country as an officer in the Navy, something he'd wanted since before he was in the first grade. He graduated with distinction from the U.S. Naval Academy in 1946. When Admiral Rickover began his program to create nuclear power submarines, Carter wanted in on that and was selected to assist, quote, in the design and development of nuclear propulsion plants for naval vessels. Although the Chalk River nuclear plant was in Ottawa, Canada, it produced about half of the North American supply of medical isotopes. That use, plus the plant's physical proximity to the U.S., made the meltdown in the reactor core on December 12, 1952, a national security issue for the United States. Jimmy Carter, at age 28, was selected to lead a team of 26 men to do the hazardous repair and cleanup. It was the very first nuclear reactor meltdown ever. With the clock ticking, they trained on a duplicate model reactor on the site, since each man would have only 90 seconds to do their part of the job as they were each lowered into the reactor. Carter took his 90-second turn with all of the others and had himself lowered into the damaged reactor. He and his team exposed themselves to 1,000 times the level of radiation considered safe by today's standards. He had wanted a career in the Navy since his earliest years. He got it. He loved it. Rosalind was happy. But his father was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer shortly after the nuclear incident. By July of 1953, his father had died, and Carter, after much anguish and prayer, decided to give up his Navy dream in order to return to Plains and manage the family's peanut farm. A George Bailey move, if there ever was one. We know about his presidency, about the peace he brokered between Israel and Egypt, about the Nobel Peace Prize. His post-presidential work for Habitat for Humanity is so well known that almost every cartoon published since his passing has him physically building homes for others in heaven. And almost every set of photos includes the one of Carter at 95 years old, his face badly banged up from a fall that needed 14 stitches, still out on the work site swinging a hammer and building homes right beside Rosalind. Those who worked on homes with him, as well as reporters who went to those job sites and the Secret Service men who had to go with him, have testified that he was always the first to arrive on the site and the last to leave. Those were not photo ops. The Carters were always offered a nice room to sleep in on those jobs, and they always gave it to others, while they slept on the floor of a local church with the other volunteers. Less known is Jimmy Carter's work through the Carter Center on Public Health, especially on common but horrific diseases like guinea worm and river blindness, found only in sub-Saharan Africa. While I forget who did the interview, sometime in the last decade, Carter was asked what his goals were now that he was entering his 90s. What did he hope his legacy would be? He answered that he wanted to outlive the last guinea worm. He wanted that disease totally eradicated from the planet. Brace yourselves. Here's a brief description of the guinea worm parasitic infection by Brian Klass. Quote, "The infections come from stagnant water in which the worms lay their larvae, but the worms mature inside the human body. Over the course of a year, an infected person eventually plays host to a worm that grows to become 1 meter, 3.3 feet long. Once fully grown, the worm creates a lesion on the skin and then escapes from the body, usually producing agonizing pain in the process. Most of the time, these worms exit through the legs or the feet. Fully removing the worm can take days or weeks. It's extremely painful and often leads to secondary infections. Most people who get sick are debilitated for weeks or months, and some develop permanently disabling joint pain." When Carter decided to take on the guinea worm in the mid-1980s, there were just under 4 million infections every year across 21 countries. In 2023, that number was 13. Not 13 countries, 13 cases, down from almost 4 million. As of the time of his passing 1 week ago, there were 7 in all of 2024. Not quite 0, but almost. Doing that work paid him nothing in tangible returns. The headlines this week aren't lauding his work fighting guinea worms. He got no social capital from that. He didn't own stock in a guinea worm pharmaceutical or medical device company. He got no awards for it, no recognition, nor did he expect or even want any of those things. Jimmy Carter didn't focus on the guinea worm because a friend or a relative had been debilitated by it, or because it was a threat either in Georgia or here in the United States, although those would still have been laudable reasons to take on a disease. Carter focused on the guinea worm simply because millions were suffering from it and nobody seemed to care. His faith taught him that. Jesus taught him that, to care for the least, the last, and the lost. Read the tributes, watch the speeches and services. As you do so, ask yourself, what shapes a man like that? There are not many of them. Talk about his life with your children and grandchildren, especially your boys. There is such a crisis right now surrounding what it means to be a man. If allowing yourself to be lowered into the melted core of a nuclear reactor, teaching Sunday school and living those values, becoming president, being faithful to your spouse for 77 years, lusting in your heart notwithstanding, and then spending the 44 years of your post-presidential life volunteering to build houses for those who have none, sleeping on the floor, and raising money to eradicate painful diseases for those you don't know and will never meet. If all of that isn't a shining example of manhood, I don't know what is. The world is starved for such men, and men are starved for such examples. There is every indication that the terrorist attack in New Orleans was carried out by a man who was radicalized just in the midst of such a crisis when he was a different person just a year ago. Let your children and grandchildren see such a person lauded for a life well lived, lying in state in our nation's capital. Let your sons and your daughters know that they can do it too. Let them know that that's one version of what it means to be a Christian. One version of what it means to follow Jesus. Let the light from Jimmy Carter's star guide you this month. His star, like the star that guided the wise men, will lead you to the exact same place. Amen.